Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third event of the Global Challenges series. I'm Dawisson Lopes, and along with Professor Aziz Saliba, we'll be hosting this session this morning, a very special one, one which is dedicated to Latin America. Latin America is the region most of us come from. Many of us still live in, and definitely all of us deeply relate to. For this mission, to try to decipher this enigma, Aziz and I will rely on a very distinguished panel whose participants are Luis Velásquez. He's a former Vice Minister of Trade. He's also been a Vice Minister of Industry in his home country, Venezuela. He's served as an ambassador to Geneva, Switzerland, and he's kindly accepted to join us this morning from Atlanta in the United States of America. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you.
Secondly, Peter Wagner. Peter has extensively written and researched about Central and Eastern European countries, but lately he's devoted to Latin America, a topic he's now researching about and teaching about. He's currently based at University of Wisconsin at Whitewater. Thank you very much, Peter, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Daniela Campello, Professor Campello, she's a professor at Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. She's also a senior scholar at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRE. She is a former assistant professor at Princeton University, and she's just released a book, The Volatility Curse. I'm very eager to hear from you about your new book, Daniela. Thank you very much. And fourthly, Andrés Malamud. He's a very well-known political scientist from Latin America. He's originally from Argentina, now based, and for some time now, based in Portugal, in Lisbon. All of you know him, highly cited, and always controversial in his opinions. Always a pleasure to have you, Andrés.
Thank you, Dawisson.
And Carolina, my dearest colleague, Carolina, we've been friends for a long while, so I should not hide my happiness, my joy to have her as one of our panelists. Carol, she's accumulating a lot of important hats. She's now the head of UFMG's Center for Latin American Studies, and also the head of UNHCR, Sérgio Vieira de Mello Chair at UFMG. Pleasure to have you, Carolina. So guys, you know the rules. Each one of you will have 10 minutes to freely develop your points. The only thing is, I should give you a warning when your time's up. So when you reach the time limit, 10 minutes, I'll gently let you know so you can smoothly land the plane, okay? You should not interrupt your speech. I'll just let you know, and you'll be given like 2 extra minutes to conclude. And we start this morning with Luis Velásquez. Luis, who also runs a radio show in Atlanta, Georgia. He will be joining us for the first hour for some minutes. Then he'll have to leave, but still he's made some time, he's found some time to share his views on Latin America and the main challenges we face today. Thank you so much, Luis Velásquez. You have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dawisson, for this invitation. Really, very important for me. It's an honor to be part of this panel. Thank you again. When I was postgraduate professor of international economics, I recommend to my students the methodology of 3 questions when analyzing a political or economy issues. Simple but fundamental question. The 2 questions are, where we come from, where we are, and where we are going to. This is very important. And really, I have to say, I obtained good results from my students with this system. Now, if you allow me, I will use the same system. Where we come from? Really serious days. We come from a great recession that broke out in 27, serious impacting not only the country of origin, but expanded worldwide, and from which, in my opinion, we have not finished living yet. And it's manifested in the loss of value of export, mainly the raw materials. In the case of Latin America, the most unequal region in the world, the repercussions of the crisis were reflected in three ways. Number one, the decrease of trade flow. South America had growth of 2.4% of trade flow in 2017 and decrease of 2.2% in 2019 and minus 4.5% in 2020. Second, the fall in price of export, which are mostly raw materials on which Latin American countries depended highly. The decrease of capital flow, foreign investment in the region, according to the World Investment Report 2021. South American export continued to be highly concentrated in the primary sector and mining, and its economy depends on foreign money. Likewise, Latin America has historical drag, strong internal and external restriction as well. However, beyond the consequence of all economic errors, there is a characteristic that has become a constant in the region: the political instability. This is an important point. I think this is the main point in Latin America, not only. And its consequence in the economic and social sector. That is why we have been traveling the path with many thorns and stuck in each of the countries that make up the region. And to complete the game, we say that in Venezuela. It's a Venezuela expression. And to complete the game, since the beginning of 2020, we are suffering a global health crisis with the appearing of COVID-19, with a special impact in the region due to the crisis of their health care system, which allow the inability to get answer to a crisis, whatever it may be. And what is worse, we are not able to give a multilateral response, but unilateral one to the crisis, despite participation in regional multilateral systems. Where we are, trying to cushion the social impact of the health crisis, it must be recognized that in recent time, cooperation coming from outside the region has allowed vaccination campaign to be reinforced in some countries or to start in another. Trying to reactivate the economy in some countries, in others not yet, seeing the seriousness of the situation, the inability of the ruler to redirect the countries, and the scarcity of resources has become an internal or external restriction at the same time. As of March of this year, 2021, only two countries in the region, Chile and Brazil, has shown a rebound in the external sector. And when we go to the detail of that rebound, we realize that it's only about the raw materials. That figure tells us nothing about the distribution of wealth. But perhaps it's not the worst. is Latin America. It's not the worst, because political instability continues to be what identifies the region. Only one country, for example, Peru, in the last 4 years, has had 3 presidents. And in the last 6 leaders have been involved in corruption scandal, without naming a former president who committed suicide for being involved in mismanagement of public affairs. This is one of the explanations for so much political instability, not to mention the case of Venezuela, that being one of the most solid democracies in the region, happening to be the opposite. Today, it is classified as the second poorest country in the world, and one of the ones that today contribute to the world with the larger number of migrants who transfer their life expectancy to the other part of the world. Where were I going to? It's really, really, really sad. I'm afraid, and I do not want to sound as a pessimist, that in the next 10 years will be another lost decade. Recent figures provided by ECLAC, CEPAL, say that Latin America will need at least 7 years to recover at least the level of employment before the pandemic, to which a large and continuous level of financing has to be added. On the other hand, and this is more serious, we must take account that we are within the framework of the Revolution 4.0, where the central axis is digital economy. Perhaps Brazil will be the only country that could be moderated in condition to face this impact, not another country in the region. 70% of the research and development in this area is concentrated in the United States and China. The remaining 25 in other countries. Even though political instability will continue to be the principal feature in the region, also led by the parties that represent failed ideologies. There are no longer technical economic solutions to face the problem of the countries in the region. Well-trained politicians are needed who understand that it's necessary to connect with the society and not only with the public finance. It is necessary for the politician to finish understanding that the inflation is the product of instability and lack of confidence, that the value of the currency is the result of a strong, solid industry, that they have to foster proper conditions for a person and companies to be successful. Without political stability, sooner or later, person and company will suffer the same fate as others that decide to follow the siren song of the radical left. So here you have an idea of what my view is happening in Latin America. Bolivia fell into the arms of the left. Ecuador, for now, has been saved by miracle. Chile is going for a constituency in which the left has already made known that they are going for everything, and within the strong tendency for the next president to be from the left, but not represented by the left, by the ex-president Bachelet or Lagos, but the radical. In Brazil, a radicalized Lula is presented as possible option. Colombia is truly in a crisis that could presage that the candidate of the left could prevail, and Venezuela with very options to get out of the nightmare. The future don't look promising. And really, 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 I'm sorry because I'm Venezuela, I'm Latin American. A new lost decade is coming again. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. You were so punctual, 10 minutes precisely. And now I pass the floor to Peter Wagner. 10 minutes, Peter.
Dawisson, I have to go up. You know that I have a program now, I have a show, and I invite to everybody to be with me in international dialogue. It's very, 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 very good program. You were invited, Dawisson. You were with me last year.
Yes, it's a great show, the one, Peter, the one Luis runs, International Dialogue, Diálogo Internacional in Spanish, right?
Yeah.
And I invite each and everyone to give a look. It's really great, always great guests. I mean, except for me, I mean, he's made the mistake of inviting me, but all the others, they were just great, trust me.
Well,
Luis, have a wonderful day.
And I'm sorry because I have to go to the radio. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. See you soon.
See you soon.
So, Peter, 10 minutes.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. And as is, of course, clear, right? Thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to be amongst all of you. And as agreed upon, because I am indeed not from Latin America, and I currently do not reside in any Latin American country. So the agreement was that I talk a little bit about the United States and its kind of like impact in that sense. So in many ways, as all of you know, I probably don't have to emphasize that, but I just do it for good measure. It's the elephant in the room. If we're talking about the broader historical picture, the involvement of the United States in Latin America has, dare I say it, not necessarily been for the better. I think we can sort of discuss why that was the case and sort of the continuities in many ways in US foreign policy in that regard. But I do want to address in my 10 minutes of speaking the other, if you like, elephant in the room, and that is the problem of the Trump presidency and the transition, right, and the new incoming Biden presidency. For many people that I talk to, be that in Europe and indeed in other places, increasingly Latin America, the question now is, what about Trump? Was that just a crisis in the United States, a crisis that has turned the corner in that sense with Biden coming in? Or how reliable in that sense might a Biden presidency be if there is indeed the chance for another Trump or some kind of Trumpian presidential persona emerging? So in many ways, the thesis here is that the United States has actually, ironically, rejoined the kind of political and indeed political cultural context that, historically speaking, it always has been part of, namely the broader Pan-American context. So it's actually, if you're looking at the United States in terms of institutional development, in terms of its political culture, I would say that rather than always comparing the United States to Europe, which is the usual comparison, in particular when we make references to transatlantic relations, it is actually very insightful to integrate the United States into a broader Pan-American perspective. And I'm, of course, saying that in particular from the political science perspective when it comes to what is called presidentialism. So the idea that there actually is something in the institutional frame of the United States, the presidential way of separating executive from the legislature, that lends itself to particular ways of political development. This has been a point made, of course, by someone as famous as the late Juan Lintz at Yale, when he and others were talking about democratic breakdowns, that presidencies or presidentialism lends itself to this kind of problematic. And Juan Lintz and others who studied these kinds of things have always been told, well, what about the United States? Isn't the United States, right, an outlier in, assessing presidential systems in that way? And my thesis in that sense, right, the point I want to suggest on that front is to say, well, maybe the United States in its history has been lucky in that the kinds of political upheavals we've had that can be linked to the institutional frame have been few and far between. However, I also want to point out, if we're looking at the realities of US history, we can also see various crisis points in which indeed the presidency, right, and the problem of political breakdown poses itself. And I say that precisely because we have in the United States a tendency, and I can say that as a new immigrant, right, as a new American, we have sort of the tendency of judging US history and politics from a very national mythologized perspective. And in that sense, the recent, as in last year, sudden reckoning with things such as racial justice are actually not accidental, right? So in many ways, the issue of racism was baked into a history that has used in many ways race as a reference point to integrate various populations. So the issue of whiteness, right, and who actually becomes white in the end. Having said that, my second point, though, is that while there are more continuities than changes when we're looking at Trump-Biden, and we can also talk about, the recent Biden examples, such as the G7 meeting, the 2021 NATO communique. So the idea of actually having a blend of America first and this idea of American leadership. And we still do not know, I would caution everybody, right? We still do not know whether the Biden blend will be more towards the economic, political nationalism in that sense, right? Or indeed this more integration towards multilateralism. We do not yet know. I would be highly cautious given what Biden has promised the American people in his first address to the joint session of Congress, and also how that 2021 NATO communique can be interpreted, in particular its inclusion of China as a new challenge, right? I was reminded of the famous 1990s slogan in all NATO circles, out of area or out of business, right? So I'd be very cautious how that might actually all develop in the end. So having said that, right, having sort of brought sort of this idea of there may indeed be more continuity than change when we're looking at Trump presidency and the new Biden administration, I do want to make the point that since we're talking about global challenges, the big challenge actually can be summarized in one term: Anthropocene. You know, so this coming idea that we're actually living in an age where we as human beings are fundamentally altering our planetary or ecological environment. And the question therefore is, to what extent all of us, and that of course includes in particular, again, the elephant in the room, the United States, but also then upcoming economically developing countries such as China and India, will be able to jump over, if you like, their economic, political dynamics and address these kinds of issues in a broader global manner. And here too, right, I should caution everyone. What we have seen in the pandemic, right, if you like, the pandemic can be seen as a dress rehearsal for
10 minutes.
Global climate change, right? It's clear that the pathologies of the nation state formula have simply not delivered the kinds of global multilateral responses we were all hoping for. And of course, if it doesn't happen during such a big, you know, everybody clearly sees it, pandemic, this idea of global climate change is probably not going to receive the kind of global response that is indeed actually needed. So I would, in that sense, caution there. And Lewis has sort of said he hoped he would be a lot more positive. I hope that we all get through this, but we could also be the dodo who, you know, happily kind of like hops and bops about and does not realize that its time is up. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Professor Campello, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
Okay, here I am with my watch. 10. Okay, so good morning, Dawisson, the others. Very happy to be here, talk about Latin America. I'm a Latin Americanist, so I'm always happy to talk about the region. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna provide you with the lenses through which I observe economic and political cycles in Latin America. And then I'll talk about the challenges I see for the countries in the region, considering the scenario you are experiencing these days. So in my view, as some of you know, Andrés for sure, there is no way to understand economic and political cycles in Latin America without referring to the way these countries are plugged into the world economy. So we are essentially, and I'm talking about South America mostly, we are essentially low savings commodity exporting countries, And as such, our economies depend on two factors that governments cannot control. And it's a funny thing because I'm super following what Luis was saying. I'm starting pretty much in the same direction. So, and these two factors are commodity prices and American interest rates. Commodity prices because we export commodities basically, and US interest rates because they drive international capital flows in and out of emerging economies. So in that sense, these two factors determine how favorable the international scenario is to the region, and they largely determine economic cycles and political cycles typical of the region. So what I did with my co-author was to create an index that is the Good Economic Times Index that shows fluctuation, summarizes the fluctuation in these two factors. So let me share my screen very quickly. Okay, here it is. So this is the Good Economic Times Index. And I wanted to, so the point is the best scenario for Latin America happens when commodity prices are high, international interest rates are low. When that happens, we see we gain in terms of trade. Our currencies appreciate. We have growth without inflation. We become more attractive to investment. There are capital flows to the region. And of course, if the economy is doing well and people are employed and inflation is low, people are happy. We have more political stability. Presidents are more popular. We have more normal transitions of government. So very good things happen when the Good Economic Times Index is high. And very bad things happen when the opposite occurs, when low commodity prices are going down and when US interest rates are going up. Then the opposite happens. We lose terms of trade, we lose international reserves, we have inflation because of currency depreciation. People feel that through employment, lower employment, higher inflation. They aren't happy. Presidents are less popular. Transitions are less normal, regular, and there you go. The thing is, our history is a history of cycles. We alternate good times and bad times all the time. So as you can see here in the graph, I wanted to check three things basically in the graph. The first one is that we lived through exceptionally good times during the 2000s, which are probably not going to happen again. This was China entering the World Trade Organization and buying commodities, and the prices skyrocketed. So we did really well during these times. If you remember, the whole region here had lower inequality, lower poverty, people were happy, stability in the government being re-elected, so on and so forth. This changed sharply, dramatically after 2011. So the situation reversed very quickly. And as we all know, we've been through very bad times and a lot of instability. Again, so all the problems that we usually have lurking in Latin America, high inequality, violence, corruption, all of them kind of come to the forefront when bad times come, right? So if you remember in 2019, we had disruptions, political disruptions in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru, and Chile, many countries. So exceptionally good times in the 2000s, bad times, the reversal in 2011. And you need to notice that there were three reversals, big reversals in the region in the post-war period. This is the third one. The first one was in the 60s, here, in the mid-60s. And the second one was in the early 1980s. And what we can notice is that these times were times of regime change. Dissatisfaction and instability was such that people they got against not only the incumbents but against the regime as well. It's not that the crises drive democracy or drive authoritarianism, but they drive instability, and instability many times leads to this kind of disruption. So we are in the third period. So these were very bad times already before the pandemic. So looking at the current context, what do I see? The pandemic caught us in a very tough moment of instability everywhere, of economic crisis, of people frustrated after a decade of some type of economic and political development. And the pandemic, of course, deepened the crisis, right? And in this, and here in this scenario is let me talk about the challenges I see. So let me stop sharing. So the first challenge is the pandemic created a need for social assistance under very tight budget constraints. We don't have the money and people need help. Countries are going to the IMF, other countries are going to go to the IMF. The OECD is recovering already. So there is a lot, most of the countries had more relaxed fiscal and monetary policies, which is not going to happen in the next few years. So there's a pressure for adjustment. And as we know, for emerging markets, capital is pro-cyclical. So they are not here when we need them the most. So this is a challenge. Latin American left is very good at distributing in good times. So we know that from the past decade. The thing is, what do we do in the bad times? What does the left have to show us in terms of how to distribute with stability in bad times, in a situation in which you're not distributing the excess money? You have to take from the wealthy and give to the poor. We don't know how to do this. The third point is that if I could predict one thing for the next years, is an anti-incumbent trend everywhere, anti-system situation that has been going on since the debacle of 2011, but now stronger. So in that sense, we may be becoming more Uruguay than Peru, more Peru than Uruguay. So we're not going in the Uruguayan direction. So the space for adventures and populism seems to have increased in the region. We had bad experiences with populists in the recent years, but I don't think that it's leading to a reversal in terms of more institutionalization. As we know, populism and democracy don't go along very well. So we've been seeing authoritarianism that was lurking, coming again to the agenda, and military are back, and military involved in politics. Not all of them in the way they are in Brazil, which is a military government right now, but it has been going on. Authoritarian attempts in the region, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Venezuela for a long time. I think in some sense, and Peter can say something about it, that the fact that Trump was not reelected is a good thing, because there wouldn't be any push from the US in terms of trying to keep some level of democracy and impose some restriction to authoritarian attempts. But at the same time, the region is really close to China right now, depends on China, and China has this policy of non-intervention, but doesn't allow anyone to intervene as well or put pressure. So in that sense, with Bukele, China was saying, like, that's El Salvador, and you shouldn't get into this. So this may be a problem. So and then we get to the major challenge, which I think it goes back to Luis' talk very much. We need to become less volatile. I think not selling the book that is called The Volatility Curse, but we need to become less volatile. And I think that volatility is our tragedy. So because from a political perspective, we can't compare governments, because governments in the good times are not the same thing as governments in the bad times. So we can't compare the quality of the governments. We alternate euphoria and depression in a way that has very serious costs. Now I experienced for the first time in my life, like the 80s, I was too young, but that's horrible. I mean, you feel that everything is gonna happen, and then suddenly nothing's gonna happen, and your morals go to the floor. So that's really bad. These cycles harm institutional stability, and I think that's a core feature of the way we are plugged into the international economy. In bad times, what we observe in the book is that we have irregular transitions, coups, resignations. In good times, presidents manage to change the constitution with the support of the people to remain there forever. And we've seen these in the past decade. So good and bad times are bad for institutional stability, which is a dilemma. So what do we do with this? And I think we need to put in the agenda a discussion about how to level the playing field and allow South Americans to be able to compare their governments and not to vote on luck. We vote, we've been talking about the new commodity boom. We vote based on luck and not on merit. And that's a very, very bad thing for democracy and representation. We need to stop this. So what do I see? I see counter-cyclical fiscal laws have to be in the agenda, because they allow us to compare. They limit the possibility of spending too much in good times and not having the money in bad times. We need to talk about economic diversification, because our dependency on commodity exports is at the core of this whole thing. And now nobody can talk about industrial policies. We need to talk about industrial policy and diversification. And just to finish, we are entering a new cycle probably of commodity price increases, and that may be a chance to really talk about what we could have done in the past cycle and we didn't, and we could do it for the future. So I think these discussions should be, and I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. After this great intervention, I should be the one advertising the book, Volatility Curse. It just reached me a few days back, so I'm still to read it entirely, but it looks very fine. I love the cover and the roller coaster.
We fought for the roller coaster. I have no idea.
Which very much captures the idea of volatility And there's even some endorsement words by Andrés Malamud at the back. Speaking of whom, please, Andrés, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Dawisson. As Napoleon once said, I will be short. And this is because most have been said, and I will follow suit on the pessimistic tone, though I am not as pessimistic as some of you regarding democracy. I think democracy is quite strong, resilient, not of good quality, but it will survive in most of Latin America. There are other problems regarding society, mostly, which are more serious. And I have three questions to pose to you before. How do you look at the post-pandemic world? Do you think inequality will rise? Do you think informality, or call it illegality, will rise? And do you think violence, social violence, will rise? And the answer is very simple. And it depends. Because I'm almost sure it's not going to rise in North America, Europe, or Asia Pacific, but it is going to rise and by high figures in Latin America. The three dimensions are going to increase very notably. We are going to have a more unequal society in Latin America, in most countries, a more informal society, I mean job markets especially. But from this comes crime. Because who is hiring today in Latin America? The mafias, not the firms, the legal firms. And finally, violence. Latin America distinguishes itself in the world because of these three characteristics. It's not the poorest country or region, it is the most unequal. It is the most informal. Think of Peru again. Daniela mentioned Peru. Peru is a paradox. It has had the same chairman of the central bank for 15 years now. Alan Garcia appointed Julio Velarde in 2006. In the same time, Argentina has had 8 chairmen of the central bank. So the Peruvian macroeconomic policy is much more stable and much more successful than the Argentine macroeconomic policy. But regarding politics, it's the other way around. Argentina is stable in spite of the economic catastrophe, while in Peru, presidents come and go, and most of them are in jail, or they are about to go to jail, or they committed suicide in order not to go to jail. Very much like Rio de Janeiro governors, I guess, or presidents of the legislature. But inequality is on the rise. This we all know. This is not the same in Europe. This is not the same in North America. Informality, it's about 70% in Peru. Peru applied the most stringent quarantine, lockdown in their country, and it did not work because people had to go out of their homes to win the daily bread and also to buy food because many people did not have a fridge at home. So it did not work. It was a good policy in a formal country, in an institutionalized country, not in informal countries. And from informality to illegality, there is only one step, and it takes only time and not much. And finally, violence. Again, if you look at a map, we Latin Americans are about 8% of the world population, but we have about 35% of the world homicides. In the particular case of Brazil, you are about 3%, 2.5% of the world population. You are quite a lot. And you are making more Brazilians every time. I tell this to my Portuguese students because you make a Portugal every 5 years. But you have some 15% of the world homicides per year. Less than 3% of the population, 15% of the homicides. And you are not the worst case, far from that. Venezuela is much worse. Colombia used to be much worse, no longer now. So what I am observing is a bifurcation. In the past, developed countries and developing countries were supposed to converge, catching up. Those in the bottom were about to copy or emulate, or at least reap the lower hanging fruits. Now, this is not happening. On the contrary, Latin America is diverging from Europe. And think of this. Europe is not a very successful case. Yes, of course, it is democratic. Yes, of course, it is prosperous. It is stable. but it is old and stagnated. And the most important thing as regards international relations, their foreign policy goal or strategy now is called strategic autonomy. You may have heard of this. Strategic autonomy is a Latin American developed concept for secondary powers not to get commanded or not to subordinate to the central larger powers. Well, this is the policy of the European Union, whether explicitly or inadvertently, they are assuming they are placed in the world as a secondary power. And we are diverging, we are bifurcating from this secondary power. Because the largest powers are, they were mentioned, the United States and China. And the thing is that the United States and China are imposing conditions, and at the same time are providing lifeboats. We need them both for financing, for trade, for investment, for technology. But they are fighting each other. They are systemic rivals. They cooperate as well. They depend very much on each other. This is not like the Cold War, in which the two worlds were worlds apart. Now they are very much interdependent. The thing is that if they fight, when two elephants fight, the grass suffers. But when two elephants make love, the grass suffers as well. And we are grass. We are very low in the ground. The only way to take care of ourselves is to grow a tree, to grow taller, in order for the elephants to go fight or make love somewhere else. And this is about regional cooperation or regional governance. I'm not talking here strictly about regional integration. That's much more difficult. But anyway, there are ways of integrating things that they are the only things that worked in the past and the only things that prevented us from total volatility, to use this concept which is key to understand instability in Latin America. The only thing that worked regarding regional integration in Latin America or in South America is the common external tariff in Mercosur. This is the only little thing we did regarding integration. We tied ourselves to the mast. So the tariff has not moved because it can't. Is it good for trade? It's controversial. Is it good for growth? It is controversial, but it has prevented volatility. The only one thing we did well. And again, it's controversial because there are some counter side effects which are not necessarily good. But the thing is that we have to make decisions in the future, short term. We have to decide whether Huawei is going to have access to our technological markets or not. What are we going to do with our 5G technology? Are we going to allow the Chinese to come in? The US will be pissed off. Or otherwise, are we going to take the European firms because the US want for us to hire them instead of Chinese? The Chinese will be pissed off. Whatever we do, we have to do it together. Regional cooperation is about building a shield or growing a tree in order not to be stepped on by the elephants. Thank you very much.
Great talk. You can already claim the awards for best metaphors, definitely. It's been a wonderful usage of metaphors, a masterclass, as a matter of fact. Professor Moulin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dawisson, Aziz, and my fellow colleagues for sharing your thoughts on the challenges for Latin America. It's always good to be the last, so I can build on giants, right? So that makes my job here easier as well. I think all the former panelists have pinpointed the three, I think, biggest issues that I wanted to tackle, but perhaps from a different vantage point. The issue of political instability / democracy / authoritarianism / regime change, whatever name you want to give to this big regional challenge. I think it's there, and it's all obviously connected to how different political waves translate in the Latin American continent, right? So there's obviously, for example, a connection between far-right movements, populist movements in different parts of the world, and how they do get translated in our own regional movements. The issue of inequality, which is perhaps more salient and preeminent and urgent as a regional issue that should be perhaps has been historically one of the main points that has been tackled regionally, right? Luis has mentioned ECLAC, CEPAL. I mean, there has been historically a long trajectory of efforts in tackling inequality issues around unequal development within the region. And this, of course, comes now on an intersectional kind of approach, because we do have to consider directly issues of race and gender. And I think Peter has pointed to the issue of racism, and this is a structurally feature of how inequality plays in Latin American countries specifically. And perhaps the question of violence and how those things connect to violence. And then I will twist to what I think is my perhaps small contribution to the panel, which are the human consequences, or one of the dimensions of the human consequences of these three big processes in Latin America, which is the issue of displacement. How those three things revert to important, a central regional issue, I think, in the 21st century, which is how we deal with displacement in general, but forced displacement in particular. And perhaps here I want to highlight 3 points as well. The issue regarding numbers. We have been in the past decades a central knot in the human mobility chain worldwide, not only in terms of labor migration, but also in terms of how we produce forced migrants, and particularly refugees and asylum seekers. Not only because of the civil war in Colombia, that has been perhaps the historical driver in the last century, but now also the case of Venezuela, that has been consistently described as the most important humanitarian crisis globally, and has had a tremendous regional impact. As you probably know, by now there are 5.6 million Venezuelans who have fled the country, and 80 to 85% of Venezuelans are within Latin American country, the Latin American region, which means that if we don't deal with the Venezuelan crisis regionally, we will not get out of it anytime soon. So not only the consequences are regional, but also the responses should be regional. Of course, they're very unequal. I mean, Brazil is a giant, has only received a small amount of all those refugees, around 300,000 of the Venezuelans. Colombia, Peru have received, of course, for historical reasons as well, the largest number of Venezuelans. But I'm just pinpointing the numbers to highlight how massive this challenge is, and the consequences that lie in front of us, not only in emergency terms, but for the mid to long term time frames. The second point that I want to draw attention to is how we receive, right? How do we host migrants and refugees? And I think here Latin American challenges are in general global challenges, because the structure, the way the world has been setting up the migration governance has had direct consequences for how Latin American countries have responded to those challenges. Daniela has pointed to the issue of militarization of politics, and this has obviously traveled to the militarization of humanitarian assistance. The issue of dependence on donors, on an emergency logic of reception that has left issues of long-term integration left to the last part of the regional agenda. So this is a central issue that requires a regional stepping up, including in relation to how we dialogue and demand help from rich countries, rich donors who do not want, right, asylum seekers, Latin American asylum seekers and migrants on their doorstep. The third point is coordination. And I think here I will echo Andrés' remarks about the need to think regionally. I think perhaps if Mercosur tariff is one of the good examples, I also think that one of the good examples of coordination, of thinking normatively, legally, in regional terms, has been the issue of refugees. Latin America has been at the forefront historically on thinking about devising legal frameworks that can discuss, for example, burden sharing between countries, coordination of technical issues, assistance in humanitarian and border management, ever since the early 80s. So we do have a historical track on developing regional approaches to migration, mobility, particularly issues regarding asylum. But we've lost some of that track in the past couple of years for reasons of political instability, for different foreign policies regarding countries of origin of asylum seekers in the region. That has had a direct impact on how we respond to that. And of course, because the numbers have risen, this has required a much more complicated regional arrangement, in the sense that we're not only talking about international actors, national governments, but we're increasingly talking about civil society and subnational actors. And that complicates the picture in very heterogeneous and different ways. So to think about public policies, for example, for integration and for migrants, for refugees, this will require including cities, neighborhoods, all sorts of social movements that are governmental, non-governmental, locally based, transnationally based. And that's a very complicated assemblage, a very complicated network that requires somehow regional coordination, but that our instruments of regional governments, and I would say global governments, are ill-suited for organizing at this point. So this is one of, I think, the biggest challenges. And the third point I want to perhaps to conclude is how local challenges, right, regional challenges about inequality, labor, violence, how they also affect in very unequal ways these specific displaced populations, right? We're conducting a preliminary research on Venezuelans in Brazil, and what we can tell from our preliminary data is precisely that we do have a higher unemployment rate among Venezuelans, including those that have been part of official public policies in relation to Brazilian nationals, of course, higher informality rates, specifically gender issues regarding access to public services, to employment policies, to social policies, including those related to the pandemic. Very concerning impact on children. As you know, half of the displaced population in the world is composed of children. And this is a particular challenge for Latin American countries who already have very difficult, very precarious social policies for those groups. And of course, the pandemic has been particularly brutal for families and children, specifically in relation to school education and as a central element for integration. I think I will end on Andrés' notes that there are no subnational or national solutions to the kind of problems we're facing. especially in a, I don't think there is a post-pandemic world, but in an age of pandemics world, it seems that pandemics are here to stay, as well as migration and mobility will be a central trait of any issues regarding our region. So we should include, I think, mobility as a central transversal element in any analysis about the challenges our region faces. So I think I was very obedient in relation to my time slot.
You were, and so were your colleagues. This is a very disciplined group, which makes me happy, as a matter of fact. And it's been a great round of interventions where your talks have nicely overlapped. So I'm very happy with the outcome, actually. Thank you for this. And now let's start with our Q&A. I should invite my dearest colleague, co-editor of the Global Challenges series, Professor Aziz Saliba. Aziz, it's all with you now.
Thank you very much, Dawisson. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with such distinguished guests, and to hear such elaborated presentations on actual global challenges of this region we're proud to be part of. I have a few questions here. I have 3 questions, which I'd like to pose to the 4 of you. And it's more, I will tell you that it's more an exercise, in part at least, it's more an exercise of forecasting than an actual reading of the current situation. But we have recently experienced in South America pink tide when Cristina Kirchner, Lula, and then Dilma, Ollanta Humala, and Bachelet won the elections. We then had a blue tide. There is a set of conservative victories with Macri in Argentina, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski in Peru, Sebastián Pinera in Chile, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Guillermo Lasso in Ecuador. Now, if we look at the recent elections in Argentina, Uruguay, and Peru, the signals, or the colors, if you prefer, have been more mixed. So I would like to rely on your forecasting powers to perhaps see the near future colors of South America, talking about the next 5 years here. How do you see this part of the world in the next 5 years? The issue of inequality was very much discussed here, and this reminds me of the book by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. And Mr. Piketty, among other things, argues that the rate of capital return in developed countries is persistently greater than the rate of economic growth, and that this contributes to wealth inequality. And among his proposals, he discusses a global tax, a proposal that has been receiving growing support. I would like to hear your thoughts about how much of the fight against inequality is or will be local, regional, and global. And finally, I think that at least 3 of you have discussed the issue of Chinese influence. More importantly, Peter Wagner has discussed this issue in the US, and we see that the concern displayed by Trump seems to be shared by Biden. Now, the question is, how will the US counter China's rising influence in Latin America? What is the strategy? So I also would like to thank you for your excellent presentations. I'd like to say that it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I look forward to hearing your views on these provocations.
Okay, so we should start with Peter. And Peter, you can like tackle the 3 questions. You can choose one. I mean, it's all on you now.
Oh my God. Well, first, thank you for the questions. They're really, I mean, all 3 great questions. I wish I had a crystal ball. I would make a lot of money, you know, but on that first question, I would therefore kind of punt and leave it to the other panelists to address. I find it, from my perspective, just an interesting question to actually ask, to what extent we can speak of political parties in various contexts. And I think political science in general has sort of made this trade-off by using essentially organizations that run candidates for office in lieu of what people like, say, Roberto Michels thought of as political parties, namely sort of independent bureaucratic organizations with a platform that actually exist even outside of the electoral process. So I punt, but I would really think of it more as a question about potential electoral coalitions that may or may not emerge in the near future. This is also true, by the way, for the United States. If we're looking at what it means when we're talking about Republicans and Democrats in that respect. So yes, I tell my students all the time, maybe it's time to actually question the very existence of political parties in the United States. But, I provoke them, they look at me and, So anyway, but the second question, I would say all of it, right? If we cannot figure out inequality at the local, the regional, yes, the national, if you like, although I'm skeptical, never mind, we can discuss that. But, the local, the regional, and indeed the global level. If we cannot figure out this issue, it will haunt us, in particular when it comes to, once again, responses, pandemic, but also global climate change. So I think it has to be, in that sense, an integrated response to inequality. And yes, having this idea of a global, minimal tax is a first step, I think, in the right direction, right? For my view, my personal view, for actually addressing the impact of global financial streams. The third point, more for me, and that gets me to what I said, right? The United States, on the one hand, has always talked a very good game when it comes to rights, democratic rights, but it has also always been a very sort of national security focused in its foreign policies. And what I've been observing when it comes to the US relation to Central and South America, it has always been about security. It's never really been about development in that sense, right? It's always been about security. And to that extent, the interest of the United States, again, right, thinking about foreign policy as sort of an actual connective tissue between domestic interests, state elites, right? The interest there clearly is not necessarily about authoritarianism versus democracy, the big Biden slogan, right? We need that big coalition. It really is more about how to counter the encroachment of what the US foreign policy elite has begun to think of as competition, if not indeed a clear challenge to its global position, as the leading and determining nation interest in that sense. So how will it counter that? Money, but potentially also certain sort of strong arming in terms of, potential sanctions on firms that cooperate maybe with China, etc., etc. It will be, in that sense, possibly more successful than the attempt by the United States to push the European Union in this kind of, direction. But that, right, this type of like securitization is what we're looking at in the end.
Okay, great. Daniela, your thoughts?
Oh yeah, many thoughts. Try to be brief. With respect to the color, to be very honest, I don't buy the move to the left, move to the right as if it's something regional. And I don't think that ideology drives vote in Latin America at all. I don't think we have evidence of that. What I believe is that people vote against the government in bad times and vote for the government in good times. And the left somehow many left-wing governments were elected in the beginning of the 2000s and were able to govern as such as left-wing governments and did well. We were in good times and favorable times. So I can see the issue of the color as something, I think it's fun for analysts, but I don't think that really pictures reality in Latin America. I think it gives too much emphasis on ideology, which is, I don't think that's what drives politics here. Second thing about the global tax, the global inequality, I think that I couldn't agree more that it's a global phenomenon. If you look at what happened to inequality in the post-war years, in which we had the Bretton Woods system and no capital mobility, and then you see what happens after 1970, suggests strongly that capital mobility has something to do with incapacity of the governments to redistribute. So in that sense, I really believe it's a systemic thing. And if you are the only one controlling capital, then the others are not. Of course, capital just flees. So it's something that has to be some level of consultation. I think that volatility in capital flows is a really bad thing. But again, I think it follows our economic volatility. So if we manage to deal with the economic volatility, most probably this would be a lesser problem. And with respect to Chinese influence, I think we could get the best of all worlds. I mean, we have the US never cared about us in terms of economic development because the Soviet Union never cared about us in terms of economic development. So many countries managed to play out the two big powers and got things with that, like Asia. And so I think that with China, we could do this. We could like have more autonomy because we didn't have policy autonomy under the US, right? IMF and World Bank. And at the same time, we could have a more economic development. But this is one thing that I couldn't agree more with Andrés. It has to be done together. And the weird thing is that in Brazil, we don't even do as a country. You have like governors negotiating with China, and China is like China, is the big China. If we don't get together to solve these things, I think we are going nowhere. So in that sense, I think we could get very good things from the fact that the US and China cares about Latin America. And of course, now US has to look at us too because of China. But it could be the worst of all worlds if we don't manage that in the right direction.
Great. Andrés, your reactions.
Thank you, Dawisson.
Professor Dawisson, just before Professor Andrés Malamud speaks, let me just take this opportunity to invite Professor Daniela Campello to have her book released here in Belo Horizonte whenever the pandemic allows us to do so. It will be a great pleasure to have you discussing the volatility curves here and then presenting the book to our community. I also hope to be able to have the other distinguished guests here, Peter Wagner, Andrés Malamud, Carolina Moulin is always with us. But I also hope to have the two of you with us in the near future, whenever this pandemic allows us to do so. But
if we could not do that in person, then we could do that as we are doing right now. I'd be happy to, very happy.
excellent, excellent. We have done a couple of book presentations online. It's second best, right? I mean, I look forward to having face-to-face presentations again, because then you get the author to sign the book, you get the opportunity of having some small conversation afterwards and so on. And I think this makes any book presentation even greater. So again, please forgive me for interrupting you, Andrés, but I just wanted, I do not want to finish this presentation without inviting you to come, and especially for taking this opportunity to invite Daniela Campello to have her book presented here at UFMG.
I am looking forward to going personally. It'll be great. We miss Brazil from outside, really. I know you may be fed up sometimes, but we really
outside from Brazil, Andrés.
I know. Not that Argentina is doing so well, anyway. Great questions, Aziz. I will not refer to the inequality issue because Daniela and Peter have responded nicely. So I will focus on the other two. First, regarding what is going to happen with Latin America in 5 or 10 years. I can see an internal bifurcation as well. I mentioned before the external bifurcation. Latin America and Europe are following opposite paths. Within Latin America, it is happening something like that. North from Panama and south from Panama. North from Panama is almost everything kind of an economic satellite of the United States. And this is not a value judgment. This is a description. These countries north of the Panama Canal depend on the United States for trade, investment, migration, remittances, tourism, finance, you choose. And the United States is interested in Latin America just because of migration. It was not like this in the past. In the past, the interest of the United States was kind of the Albert Einstein relativity formula, EMC square, well, E for energy, that is oil mainly, M for migration, and C for cocaine square. But now the US is producing its own oil, almost self-sufficient, and it's producing its own drugs as well, artificial or opium-derived. So they don't need our oil and our drugs, and they don't need our migrants. And this is what they care about. And this is about Mexico and the Northern Triangle. So I can see a bifurcation. The United States is going to invest much in the northern part of Latin America. And therefore, there is a larger margin of autonomy for South America to do good or bad things. And based on experience, we are going to do bad things. But we need to keep some optimism as well. And here is the thing. The last question by Aziz is, what is going to be the US strategy to counter China in Latin America? And what we see, based on studies, mainly one from 4 political scientists, one of which is Brazilian, Amancio Oliveira, and the other 3 are from Argentina, Schenoni, Urdines, and Moulin, is that China is not pushing the United States in Latin America. It is waiting for the US to recede. And then it bides its time. And they have time, and they measure time in a different way as we Westerners do. So again, China is entering into our countries. We are depending more and more, as Danielle explained before. And so we are fragmenting, diverging, bifurcating within Latin America. How do I see Latin America in the future? I can see 2 Latin Americas. One of them very much dependent on the US. It may be orderly or not, and the other loser in the sense, and loser with 1 O and with 2 O's. But there is a margin of autonomy. There is room for maneuver for South America. We may end up better off or worse than the other part of Latin America, but the other ones don't have a choice. We do, we South Americans. I don't know whether we are going to make the right choice, but at least there is something that we could do again together, not alone. It depends on whether we are going to join forces in order to create anchors to prevent volatility. So far, there is another question there on the side, Dawisson, but I don't know whether you want us to respond to them now or later.
No, please proceed now.
Okay, thank you. Because Luis was asking how to proceed in Mercosur, diversity, how could we make Mercosur be a better elephant caretaker? Well, the thing is, Mercosur works in the past because of interpresidentialism. We can no longer trust interpresidentialism because we cannot trust our presidents. So we have to go for a different way. And there is a way. It's called neo-functionalism in integration theory, which is, to be short, technocratic cooperation, transnational networks, doing things together in spite of the presidents we have. And we have been doing this all along, even during the pandemic. The ABAC, nuclear cooperation, has been going on. Private planes with engineers inspecting each other's installations, nuclear installations. And well, Matias Spector in Brazil, Isabel Alcañiz from Argentina, they have studied how this works. And this works in very specific policy areas. I think this is the way forward. It's no longer politicizing integration, it's depoliticizing integration. It's depresidentializing integration in order to go technical, functional, transgovernmental networking. Thank you.
Excellent. And now, Carolina, let us know your thoughts.
I'll be very brief because from my vantage point, which is migration mobility, it's interesting to see that China is not an important player for the region in discussions about humanitarian management, migration management, asylum. So it's a mainly Western world we're talking about. And here the US and Europe, right, have important traction, not only because of what Andres has said, that Central America, if you look at El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, even Haiti, right, are countries that are looking to the US, but have increasingly looked as well to South America as a destination point. So I think this is an interesting dimension in which China is somewhat absent. And I think it's an interesting point to highlight. In terms of tendencies, I think for the next 5 years, I agree with Andres that there is some technocratic arrangements. In the issue of migration, this is precisely that, right? Despite important political instabilities, a lot of the humanitarian reception, migration policies have continued in spite of, I mean, there is always this paradox, for example, in Brazil, right? How can we have had a right-wing government that has been I would say that has recognized the largest number of refugees in Brazilian history? That's always a question that appears, you know, in panels. How can you conciliate a very authoritarian militarized government with, you know, the regularization of hundreds of thousands, dozens of hundreds, right? We haven't reached 1,000. We are around 200,000 Venezuelans who have been regularized in Brazil. But historically, this is remarkable, even within the region. So the challenge is precisely that, because I think we will manage political instability. I don't see we're moving away from political instability in the next 5 years. With tactical approximations to issues that somehow climb on the agenda, right? And technocrats, different groups, interest groups will capture the agenda according to their interests, and that's politics. So I'm not sure we can depoliticize. I don't think technocratic governments is a depoliticization movement. It's a different kind of politics, perhaps a different kind of capture. I actually think we will live in very politicized environments in the coming years. And perhaps migration will be a good vantage point to look at it, because as you know, Latin America is becoming again an immigrant region, right? So we're expelling people. And that means and historically the Latin America diaspora has had an important impact, not only on issues on development, but also on issues of social organization, mobilization. So we might be entering, re-entering, in the next 10 years, the next decade, an age in which Latin America diaspora can play an important role in fostering different agendas in regarding to domestic and regional politics.
Great points. And well, if I'm following you guys accordingly, there's a tone of pessimism from the start. I mean, there even might be some room for optimism. And for instance, Andrés has left the door open for some autonomous actions and maybe some integrated responses on the part of Latin American countries. But still, what prevails, if I am inferring correctly, is some pessimism in your words. I mean, each one of you has left us with some provocative words and some words of concern. Well, the thing is, and here I want to hear from you and to provoke you towards the opposite direction. So would there be room for a positive Latin American agenda now? And what do I mean? Maybe I should hint at what I have in mind. You have just shared with us that the US is emphasizing some agendas now and then, not just under Biden, but before him, agendas related to narco trafficking, illegal migration, violence, and the like. So this is very much how the US sees Brazil and the rest of Latin America. I have this impression. And possibly that applies to Europe as well, most possibly, and to Asia to some degree. I mean, the idea that they make of Latin America, the image, the contours of Latin America are not very positive. We are not seen against a good light. But on the other hand, we still are, I mean, we as a region, Latin America, still is a huge reservoir of, for instance, clean electricity, food, energy of all sorts, as a matter of fact, not just clean, and especially environmental resources writ large. So biodiversity, the forest. I mean, doesn't it count at a time when in the US they keep speaking of a Green New Deal? The Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party is always claiming they want to become a green major power in the future. And the European Union has been committed to green standards. I mean, can't we use it as a foreign policy asset? Latin America, can't Latin America try to impose a positive agenda if we are together, if we integrate our foreign policies? All that granted, But I mean, can't we see it from another perspective, a more positive one? So this is the provocation I leave you with. And now I think we should start with Daniela. So I'll give Peter more time so he can react in a more, reasoned way, and I'll give him more time. So Daniela.
Yeah, that's I'm not very well known for my optimism with respect to Latin. But I think the potential is there, and I don't think that anyone would disagree that there is potential. There has always been potential. We are the country, the region of the future. But I think that for that potential to happen, so I'm always very uncomfortable saying what should be done, because we are political scientists and we say we know what we see, but what should be done, we should say how to be done. And I think that goes back to one question that Fernanda asked about, like, we need a state that works, we need technocracy, but we are going in exactly the opposite direction. So if I was talking about the left and right in Latin America, I think if there's one trend that it's very clear, it's populism. We are not becoming more institutionalized, we're becoming less institutionalized and more politicized in the bad way. Of course, I think that everything is political and could be well politicized. But right now, I think that politics are becoming more, how can I say, oriented towards these big names, and like parties are weak. And so in that sense, I think there is potential, no doubt about the environmental agenda is where we can place ourselves in the world with advantage, right, with respect to other countries. I really insist that the fact that China and US, that China has a strong interest in Latin America that will somehow trigger some interest from the US that the Soviet Union never did, creates a potential for doing things. But again, I think it depends on governance. And I don't see very good signals in the governance side. And when we talk about like doing things together, and of course, I think I was always thought this was the way. And I joke with my husband that if there was one reason for me to leave academia, it would be to work in Latin American integration. I really like this, and I think it's a project. But if you see that right now, like presidents can only talk to like left to left, right to right. I don't think we're moving in this direction at all. So I think the potential, I have no doubt about that, but I don't see the governance going in a direction to explore this potential to the fullest. So and again, not very optimistic. Maybe the space we get from China and the US might open up opportunities. And let me say one thing, okay, one optimistic thing. We may be entering a new cycle of commodity price rises. And this opens up opportunities for doing things. Of course, the first opportunity the politician sees, well, that's great, I'm going to be reelected because I'm spending it all. Like it was always like this, right? But there is an opportunity to think about mechanisms to save, to use this for investment in the long term. And it's not a usual thing. It doesn't happen in many countries. So create sovereign wealth funds, for example, one of the things that I'm studying. It's very hard in democracies. It's very hard in democracies that don't have a long-term horizon like ours, that don't have parties and institutionalized systems. But still, I think this new boom again opens a window that we could be using for development. So that might be one good thing to say.
Daniela, before passing the floor to Andrés, and since you have touched on Professor Fernanda Simini's question, Simini posed more or less the following question. I mean, there is one very typically Latin American dilemma. In order to diversify our economies, we should rely on state capacities, strong foundations. And now there's this wave of authoritarianism all across the region, all across the world to some degree. And how can one reconcile these two things, given that populist authoritarian leaders, they will invest on weakening institutions, not on strengthening them. And we need them strong, right, in order to induce economic diversification. So this is a very interesting and paradoxical situation. What should we do, Professor Malamud? I know you are a political scientist, you're not supposed to give answers, but I keep trying. Let's see what happens.
It's a great point, and I was about to refer to it as well. But you asked us, Dawisson, to be optimistic, and I will make an effort because you are a friend. I will start by the resources Latin America has, and then I will think of the possibilities, the windows of opportunity or the instruments that can be used in order for these resources to be put into action. First, you mentioned already, Latin America is resource rich. This is not always good. We know very well the resource curse, which Daniela has studied. Sometimes it's not good to have many resources of a certain kind, especially if it is only one and you depend on exporting it to make a living. But anyway, if you have a diversity of resources at your disposal, is potentially better than lacking them. Second, it is a nuclear weapon-free region. It still is. So there are many other regions in the world in which countries have the bomb. It's not safe to have a neighbor with a bomb, especially if the government of this neighbor is unstable. So I feel much more comfortable, let's say, in the bottom of the world, in Argentina, living together with Brazil, far away from these crazy guys with the red button. Third, and this is important, and I am in Europe, and this is not politically correct, so I will mention especially, it. The Holocaust did not happen in Latin America. These crazy guys here are democratic and prosperous today, but they did the Holocaust and 2 world wars. And what about the...
May I interrupt? We didn't have the Holocaust, but in Brazil we had slavery, and I would say that it's like very, very comparable in terms of disaster for future years.
Yeah, not good at all. But slavery, well, it was the Europeans as well who provoked it. They created the thing. And we cannot say we were victims, but somehow it was the Europeans as well. We cannot blame any longer the Europeans, but they did worse things that we did. Or the Cultural Revolution in China, or what Stalin did again. And the US also had slavery. So we are far from the worst in the world. Focusing into Fernanda's question about institutions, I'm not sure any longer whether it is convenient to have strong institutions. In an entropic world with volatility everywhere, it is much more convenient to have adaptive institutions than strong institutions. We may be kind of the special, the best region to experiment with adaptability, because we have never been strong regarding institutions. By strong, you may mean also adaptability, not necessarily to be stiff. But in any case, we haven't had stiff institutions nor adaptive institutions, but weak institutions. We can go for the adaptive institutions rather than the strong institutions for them to be able to buffer, because we are very sensible, very vulnerable to external shocks. And if it is rigid, an institution will break. So in order to, well, thinking of Nassim Taleb's anti-fragility, let's go for anti-fragility, not necessarily strength. This is Darwin as well. It is not the stronger that survives, but the fittest. How can we do? How can we make use of these resources we have? We are peaceful, violent but peaceful. We have resources, no nuclear weapons. Well, there are 2 ways. The first one is bouncing back. We have been doing this for a long time now. Argentina is an example, bouncing back. Every time we go up, we are a little bit lower than the rest of the countries around us. But anyway, we can bounce back. We can think of this. It is happening in Venezuela. Venezuela was a total disaster, but the situation in Venezuela is not unilinear. It is curvilinear, because now there are 6 million Venezuelans living abroad sending remittances. So the Venezuelans who remain in Venezuela are making a living out of money that comes from failure, the paradox of failure. The same for the Northern Triangle in Central America. People are making a living out of remittances. And I studied this as regards migration of political scientists in Brazil and Argentina. And you know that the Brazilian academic market is much larger and much more successful than the Argentine academic market. This is why most of you went back. It's very difficult for Argentines to go back. We don't have this possibility. But the consequence for Argentine political science is good, because our research agenda is more diversified and our international networks are more globalized. It's the paradox of failure. So bouncing back. And second, jumping phases. Think of Africa. It's a very large continent. They never had the chance to have line phones, right? Phones, old-fashioned, connected to the line physically. They went directly to mobile phones. And so they caught up. And they are, of course, there's poverty in Africa, but they are well connected. And they did it because they jumped a phase. This is what we can do. This is about imagination. This is about intellectual resourcefulness. This is about entrepreneurship. But there is the possibility of not necessarily catching up in the same way as others did. Let's not take the same ladder others took. Let's take advantage of the other ladder that we need to invent.
I'll have a number two. It looks more like survival than like jumping ahead in terms of development.
That's right, but you're the pessimistic in the group.
Carolina, your turn.
Again, I'll be very brief. I really like Andrés' remarks on being adaptive, anti-fragility, anti-frail, rather than there is a large literature on resilience, right? In international relations, political science. How do you make resilient institutions and resilient individuals? The issue of resilience is also a central element in a neoliberal, financialized, precarious global economy as well, right? But I'm very pessimistic. I follow Daniela on that. I don't think there is a silver lining here, you know. I really think that we will endure another very bad couple of years in relation to social protection. I don't even think remittances are a big issue in terms of it's remittances, because it's the regionalization of poverty. If you see the situation, for example, of Venezuelan migrants in different countries, it's a complete, I would say, survival is indeed the word, right? It's surviving every day on the basis of donations, of small government allowances, of militarized assistance. It's a very, we don't have the Holocaust, but we do now have large refugee camps throughout different borders in Latin America. This is the reality specifically in South America, but increasingly also in Central America. So we do have the camp mentality spreading out in the region. Of course, I don't want to say that the logic of the camp, the refugee camp, is the same as the concentration camp, but there is a tendency to think spatially about how to organize poor, precarious populations and control and discipline their bodies and movements that is becoming increasingly insidious in the region. And that's sponsored by rich governments, rich countries. There's a lot of money. There's a political economy of managing those populations that is highly global. And that has been, I would say, successful in Latin America in the past 5 to 10 years. We have translated that kind of mentality, the border mentality of the US and Europe, to our own terms in rather successful terms. So I don't know, I think even the issue of remittances is a double-edged sword for the region in a way for the coming years. It has been important in the past decades, second half of the last century, but I think it's increasingly being used as a way of managing the poor. So even on that front, I'm not sure we can be optimistic. So sorry, Dawisson, you're a good friend, but I will not I will not bend on the optimistic front.
I can't blame you. I mean, there are good reasons for your pessimism. But I was just remembering a couple of minutes ago that when I've first been to India, to New Delhi, I heard the expression brain gain. I had never heard of it before. And so they as opposed to brain drain, of course. So, I mean, they were selling the idea that the Indian diaspora was very, very positive. It really brought the foundations for India's development, ongoing development. So, I mean, can't we, and I am drawing on Andrés.
But I mean, see where India is now, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is controversial.
It's really, I mean, look at the poverty level, look at the institutional response to the pandemic.
No doubt. But they are making progress. I mean,
tiny positive points with respect to Fernandes, because I didn't address her question specifically.
Please go for it.
No, but this, I'm sorry, goes to Brazil. It has to do with Brazil. I think that one hope that I have is that the trauma that we experienced with this complete destruction of institutions that we are experiencing right now in Brazil might lead, if and then I'm gonna look partisan, but I'm not, because if those that read my book, I'm critical of former governments of the PT, but I think that if Lula happens to be elected, we are gonna be with a party that has been through good times and bad times in Brazil, has done many things that worked, many things that didn't work, and I think there's gonna be a chance for state capacity to come back, and maybe if the commodity boom, which I argue that is exogenous, but then if Lula comes again with a new commodity boom, nobody's gonna trust me anymore. I think that might be an opportunity for rethinking stuff that has been done in a bad way in the past, and eventually strengthening some capacities that we need to have. Again, I agree. I understand the point of Andrés of the flexibility, but I think we need strong institutions. Since we need parties, we need a state that participates in development, because when we are in bad, like the SUS, for example, I think that it was a major example of, like, people were talking about privatization of water, but now everybody realizes that health is not a good thing to be privatized. Now, since yesterday, everybody realizes that maybe some stability is good for the public sector. So I think we need to strengthen some institutions that we do have, and that might be an opportunity with a new boom. And I think that the opportunities are in the good times, and but we need to think about them. And I think that there's an opportunity if there comes a government like of the PT that had this historical this history in Brazilian politics, that might be a possibility that these things are thought through, because we learn what is it not to save in the good times and then let another president join the bad times, and we know what happens, right? So maybe there was some learning.
Thank you, Daniela. Just to provide Peter with some background information, Daniela just mentioned that people in Brazil now think public service stability is a good thing because there's one guy who is blowing the whistle. You're aware of this within the context of this CPI. Okay, so your turn. Let us know your reactions.
My reaction is fairly simple. It's always great when one is together with political and social scientists, because we all actually have some very fundamental ideas about how things can improve. Right? So if I'm looking back at what was said, even in terms of the criticism and the pessimism, right? Even that provides one with the ideas of what actually needs to be done. The problem is always power. In other words, we as political and social scientists can always get together, and even if we come from different, intellectual traditions, and we can actually agree on certain parameters for what are better policies. But that, right, the idea of a better policy, the idea even of regional integration in order to move us all forward, right? Even that, right, runs up to what we all actually analyze in our daily lives. The problem is power. The problem is that the best ideas founder on the fact that, dare I say it, there are people making a lot of money and, in fact, a lot of influence, as in influence peddling, by not doing the right thing. So in that sense, right, I mean, my pessimism, if you like, comes not from, the old Tina thing, right? There is no alternative. There are actually alternatives to the way we live and the fact that, we should not accept, right, the ruts we're in, if you like. There are alternatives. The problem is we encounter always actors, agents, right, people who are less concerned with the public good, or indeed just a public good, but are a lot more concerned with how well they are doing and how well sort of the people they immediately have to care about are doing. As in, best example in terms of, electoral democracies, what will get me reelected? And what will get people reelected is not necessarily doing the right thing. And so again, right, in that sense, we come back to that age-old issue of the political and social sciences power, right? Who holds it, how, why, and what are they doing with it in that sense. So that is sort of my reaction. And that is what grounds, if you like, my pessimism. Not, again, right, I just want to emphasize that. Not that there are no alternatives, but the reality is that it's, political, social, economic actors, from individuals to indeed corporations, are not necessarily on board, right? And the Habermasian idea that through discourse, right, through dialogue, we could convince them to come on board is, in the classical sense of the word, naive, right? So the classical sense, right, as in the Bildungsroman, right, the novel of education, the naive, the guy who goes out into the world and has to learn about it, right? So that is sort of what grounds my pessimism. I am hopeful, right, precisely because we continue to talk about alternatives, and we continue actually, as political and social scientists, to agree on alternatives. I mean, that in many ways is the hope, right? I mean, the ideas, the alternatives are out there.
Okay, a great set of opinions. And I have lived to see Andrés Malamud being the optimist in the room. This is unbelievable.
It's because you forced me to.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, if I had just let you speak freely, things could be different.
We are in authoritarian times.
Yeah. Very abnormal times indeed. We are now reaching our 2-hour time limit, so I invite my dear friend Aziz to give his final words.
Well, I just wanted to thank our distinguished guests for such a great discussion this morning. We have touched on many different relevant issues regarding Latin America, especially, I think, the issues of inequality, instability, migration. And I hope that for those of you who are listening to us, If you have not done so, you may download our collection free of charge. We'll provide you the link to do so. And that in the near future, we can have other discussions with Daniela Campello, Andrés Malamud, and Peter Wagner in our UFMG campus, where Dawisson and Carolina and myself will be waiting for you. So thank you very much.
It's been such a pleasure. I have not the words to thank you enough. And I hope to see you soon, anytime soon. Within 2 weeks' time, there's another event of this series. This one, the next one, dedicated to the Asia-Pacific region. We see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.